Sanctions have been imposed on 82 individuals and 29 companies. German payment provider Wirecard went bankrupt on Tuesday.
Russia has launched an unprecedented disinformation campaign against...
Billions of dollars have been found in various offshore accounts.
Welcome to Integrity Insights, the Berlin Risk podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the latest episode of Integrity Insights. Today I had the privilege of sitting down with my good friend and a great journalist, Aron Ouzilevski, who has spent the last years kind of mapping out the Russian diaspora following the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And he has just returned from Cyprus, where he did some great work looking into the kind of like the sanctions evasion through cryptocurrency exchanges. And this has been a fascinating conversation, really relevant for the work we do. So let's jump straight into our conversation with Aron. Aron, welcome on the podcast.
Hey, Philip. Thank you for having me.
Well, it is obviously a great pleasure. Let's do a quick intro. Can you tell our listeners who you are, what your background is, and what you have been doing lately?
So I have a background in journalism and kind of Russia, post-Soviet studies. For the last 2 years, I've been a fellow at the Institute of Current World Affairs. It is an American foundation that gives journalists, area studies experts, sociologists grants for 2 years, where we spend 2 years abroad really honing into a particular subject.
And what have you been doing like over those 2 years?
So the subject I've been working with is the sort of grand title is Russia's wartime emigration, and I am covering, reporting on the hundreds of thousands of Russians who left their country after Russia invaded Ukraine. Some left out of the political opposition to the war, to the Putin regime. Others left out of fear that kind of isolationism and sanctions could have on their career prospects and connection to the Western world. And then the sort of third category of people are typically men who fled in September 2022 after the Russian government announced a mobilization order. And so I've been mostly based in Tbilisi, Georgia, which is one of the major hubs, but I've also been traveling to other cities and countries where Russians have settled, either to places that have sort of visa-free regimes, like Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Serbia, or specialized visas, like in Germany, humanitarian visa programs. And my last trip took me to Cyprus, where there was already a big kind of foundational diaspora of Russian, not just Russian, but the sort of Russophone world, Russian, Belarusian, Ukrainian businessmen, entrepreneurs, and tech workers who have been attracted to the island for well over a decade for its incredibly low tax rates and sort of gray economic schemes that enable the easy flow of capital and money.
And I read, I was fortunate enough to receive your dispatch from Cyprus, which I found super interesting. And maybe we can start by kind of discussing what has been happening since the start of the war in Ukraine, since 2022, in terms of Russian influx into the country. Like, what have you observed, or what have your sources shared with you on that subject?
Yeah, so Cyprus has always been Cyprus has always been a place that initially attracted Russian oligarchs, government personnel that wanted to take their sort of dirty money out of Russia and make it clean in Cyprus, and then use that money to further invest and buy land in Western Europe. It was notorious for its now discontinued golden passport scheme, which was just an accelerated way that through investment into property, millionaires, billionaires can quickly get Cypriot passports, which then gives them access to the entire Schengen zone. Now, since the start of the invasion, the golden passport system was, I believe, discontinued in 2020. And after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, European governments have really have sort of tried to hold a magnifying glass to Cyprus, and it's been under heavy scrutiny in its sort of culture of enabling the movement of large masses of money. And I think what they really try to crack down is to make sure that Cyprus doesn't become a place where money for the purchase of weapons or the sales of oil can sort of flow through. But still, the island attracted some 50,000 Russians and Ukrainians who obviously fled their country because of the invasion and the destruction that was happening back home, and Russians who that were either moved by employees, for example, tech employees of companies that decided to completely move, fearing, for example, let's take a company like InDrive. It is a Russian rideshare company. It is actually the second largest in the world after Uber because much of its market is in South America. And out of fear of losing that entire market as a result of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine and the sanctions that came subsequently, InDrive moved much of its personnel to Kazakhstan and also Cyprus. And so among this new diaspora, there are tech workers who were flown here on company airlines, but also entrepreneurs and businessmen, some who just couldn't stand the sort of new political reality they were living in, or were just kind of motivated to retain their connections with the West and move somewhere where they can quickly secure some sort of European residence permit. Among the people I spoke to were former CEOs of major Russian streaming platforms, former boards of directors of major banking companies that are closely allied with the Russian state, but also professors who took on career switches and one professor rebranded himself as a life coach to sort of service all these Russian entrepreneurs that were coming here. So now you're seeing kind of most of the new migration lives in Limassol. It's a coastal town and it's important to note that all these people are coming to the Greek side of Cyprus, not what the Greeks would refer to as the Turkish occupied side. And there's an entire street with on the coastline that is just littered with Russian Russophone businesses, from shops grocery stores that have been there since the 1990s to major luxury apartments that were once used, that are half empty because they were once used to buy out golden passports. So it's a very the presence of Russians and Russian speakers is very visible in Limassol.
And you haven't had any experiences, or you haven't heard from sources talking about actual Russians actually leaving the country, because we've read a lot of reports that in recent years the authorities, law enforcement in Cyprus have been cracking down on Russians, closing down bank accounts, which you also mentioned in your dispatch. But if I understand you correctly, you are basically saying that there's still actually more Russians coming in than leaving the country.
I would assume that those who are leaving are the really kind of extremely hyper wealthy, hyper elites, like oil oligarchs, politicians who are allied with Putin, who are directly, being targeted by the European governments and European sanctions. But there's this sort of lower peg and lower tier of millionaires, maybe even billionaires, who continue to arrive to Cyprus because, it's a place where if they can no longer get a maybe an accelerated passport, they can still get an accelerated residency permit by, again, investing into local property, making a certain amount of money on the island, which then, paves the way for them getting a passport through kind of a legitimate process in a couple of years if they learn Greek and reside in the country. But so this has been a major destination for people who want to continue to kind of maintain their connection with Western Europe.
And this, obviously, like from our perspective, since we focus on financial crime, money laundering, the part of your dispatch that I found particularly interesting was where you describe, you have this source, I think you referred to him as Misha, this source that kind of explains how Russians convert their assets or transfer their assets from Russia to Cyprus. Can you kind of explain how this works?
Yeah, so I think it's important to draw a distinction that there's like maybe very dirty money that comes out of Russia, which is money that again belongs to oil oligarchs, resource magnates. But then there's just kind of general dirty Russian money because everything is still built on corruption in Russia. Everything, companies, even during my experience kind of reporting on the country, I didn't know a single person, and these are, ordinary young millennials living in Moscow. 9 out of 10 times people would get paid in envelopes in cash because nobody ever wanted to pay taxes, not the company, not the recipient. And so this, unless you're, for example, a doctor or a teacher who has probably the sort of cleanest record by European standards, if you are any sort of businessman or entrepreneur, one way or another, your money would still be kind of considered gray by Western standards. There's kind of so little accountability for it. And so another thing is that, as my source said, that this isn't actually a direct consequence of the sanctions regime, but this is more kind of European banks as a result of sort of discourse around sanctions, fearing to take any money in larger quantities that comes out of Russia. It has sort of posed a problem for these sort of Russian entrepreneurs, millionaires who want to, for example, sell assets, sell an apartment in Moscow, and bring the money into a Cypriot bank. So they resort to people like this Misha individual, who is a self-described kind of cryptocurrency money mover, to transfer the money into Cyprus with the use of his crypto resources. And sort of loosely, the way this works is that, say a couple want to sell their apartment in St. Petersburg. No Cypriot bank will be willing to have any sort of direct transaction with a Russian bank. So in order to do this, the couple resorts to a service like Misha's, using Telegram, which, with the recent arrest of Pavel Durov and him handing the encryption keys to the French government, might actually pose new challenges for this type of transaction. But anyway, they use his platform on Telegram. Misha's company sends out a dispatcher. The dispatcher comes, takes the physical cash and rubles, transfers it to crypto, and then in Cyprus, the crypto money is received. On the Cypriot end, another dispatcher in Cyprus converts the crypto into euros and then brings it to this couple in Cyprus.
And all this is fascinating, and all the communication takes place on Telegram.
Yeah, so when I last spoke to him, this was just a couple weeks before Pavel Durov's arrest, and so I really can't comment on it. It could be an entirely new reality, or maybe he'll revert to a different messaging app like Signal or something. But just Telegram, the format of Telegram allows for all these kind of bots and transactions that can take place, because there are all these. You can create groups, you can create sort of entire markets on Telegram that you just can't do through Signal. So, yeah, one way or another, this will certainly pose a challenge to him.
But at this point, I guess he's not really worried about it. But also, I mean, so I now understand the way this works, converting these assets, or the value of these assets back to Europe and converting into euros. But you also mentioned in your dispatch this example of one of Misha's clients, where he purchased an apartment paying the majority of the price of the property in crypto. Can you also explain that?
Yeah. So again, when I drew the distinction between dirty like oil money and then dirty money, many Russian entrepreneurs presumably have sources of income that would not be tolerated or kind of approved of by Western banks from kind of shady, questionable revenue streams. So Misha was explaining to me how one of his clients purchased an apartment on Cyprus as in part to live in it for 2 years, but also in part to wash some of the money that he had made that this client had made in Russia. So what had happened is this. So the client basically purchased an apartment in Limassol through this method. He found a developer who, first of all, he found an apartment which its market value was 1.2 million euros. But the developer was willing to accept a partial sum of that money in crypto, because then the developer, it's not going to be taxed, and the developer can pocket some of it, use it for whatever he needs. So the sort of the legal transaction was for example 500,000 euros, and this was paid in. This was done through a sort of clean mechanism. It was his clients, like 500,000 that he had in euros on his Cypriot bank, that he paid directly to the developer. But remember that the market value of the apartment was 1.2 million. So where does the rest of the 700,000 come from? It then comes in crypto, which is transferred straight to the developer. And the developer takes it, done deal, it's sold. The developer walks off with 700,000 and 500,000 in legal cash, 700,000 in crypto. The client now has an apartment with a market value of 1.2 million that he legally purchased for 500,000 euros. So in 2 years, this client will then go on to sell this very apartment to a buyer who is actually willing to go through the full process legally and transparently and sell it for its full market value of $1.2 million. Therefore, the then 700,000 gets transferred into clean capital in Cyprus and traceable. And then this client can then go to a European bank, say, I have these $1.2 million. They say, where did you get it? Here's this transaction. I sold it to a buyer. I sold an apartment to a buyer in Cyprus.
I mean, what my first question would be, I mean, what my question was when I was reading the dispatch also, because as far as I understand, the real estate seller or like real estate agents, I think they are at least officially, legally obliged to also conduct these basic KYC checks on the buyers, even if they accept cryptocurrency, which I guess is legal. But what you are basically saying is that it seems to be almost like a, or at least with this particular example, but maybe it's like even like a common practice that these real estate agents, they don't really kind of look at the source of wealth in these cryptocurrency transactions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the issue from what I had gathered, speaking to Misha, is that this was quite a common practice among Russians. He named numerous people. He named this one example of of just like to sort of break down how the process works. But this seemed completely widespread among many of these sort of millionaires and entrepreneurs that are coming to Russia. And although the European Union is trying to sort of crack down on Cyprus, I think there's still a long ways to go for it to really begin to fully regulate its market. And the place seems quite rife with corruption. I eavesdropped on some interesting conversations of certain people boasting about having local secret services in their pockets. Let me know who you need. I got local police. Even the president. So yeah, I think all of this is just shows that maybe again the dirty money is slowly getting out of Cyprus, but the dirty money is still there.
And you didn't get a sense from talking to all these people that that there was like concern among them about all these crackdowns and people like speculating or thinking about leaving, going to different places like the UAE, for instance. I know it has been very popular about Russian immigrants. Have you got any sense on that?
I did not get the impression that people were leaving. There were people who were still living in sort of two countries, that being Russia and Cyprus. Maybe they purchased property in Cyprus shortly after the war, but then realized, okay, I can still go back without ending up in jail or ending up in the army. And so they're kind of living in this in-between world. I got the impression that a lot of people were kind of there to stay I mean, almost everyone I spoke to had already acquired the residency permits. And so, I think they were keen on waiting it through until they get, European, until they get a Cypriot passport. And I really don't think the money moving element is the main draw to the island. I think not anymore, at least. I think by the looks of it, like Russians are quite nifty and will find other ways to bypass sanctions. I even asked this Misha guy, like, what are you gonna do if they start to crack down? And he said, well, I'm an entrepreneur. I'll find something else, and told me about some ideas in fintech that he had. So, and about like 4 different startups that he just launched. So I don't know. I think it'll create new difficulties for them, but I think they'll sort of continue to find these channels.
Wow, it's really fascinating. I will also make sure to link your dispatch in the show notes so that everyone can take a look at it. But I'm really grateful to you that you came all the way to Berlin to speak to us about this. What is your maybe last question? What is your next? I know that you have been covering. There's a lot of interesting stories that I've read, and anyone can read about the Russian immigration. What is your next destination?
So I'm actually at the tail end of the fellowship, and my next destination will be to return to Washington, D.C., and give my end of the fellowship report just 3 days after the U.S. elections. So we'll see whether the city is burning or not. But my last dispatch, a huge departure from the Cyprus one, will be on the current Russian exile movement in France, kind of delving into France as a place that has always been a home for Russian dissidents and exiles for over 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution. So, yeah, quite different and maybe a little bit more like a story driven by protagonists rather than the one in Cyprus.
Fascinating. I look forward to reading that as well. But thank you very much, Aron, for your time, and maybe some other time.